of prayer for Christian unity. And so, it seemed fitting today to talk about unity and the church. And one question that those outside of the church have asked me on a number of occasions is, what is the deal with all the different denominations? There's Catholics, Anglicans, Baptists, Presbyterians, and the list goes on and on and on. Well, I think to really answer that question, it would take a history lesson of monumental proportions, which I will spare you this morning. But I think it would be safe to say, in short, that it is because we are human, and division seems to be part of who we are as a broken people. As soon as we form social groups, they start to break apart due to fear, jealousy, and pride. Maintaining unity is hard. And that's a problem that the early church found out from the start. Today we read from the first letter to the Corinthians, a letter that was written by the Apostle Paul. He's the founder of the church at Corinth. And in his letters, we don't find words to all people, in all places, in all times. What we find are words for specific people, in a specific place, in a specific situation. And you can kind of get a sense of that when Paul makes those offhand remarks in verse 16. He's kind of confused as to whether he baptized anyone else. It's like, I baptized this guy and this guy. I'm not really sure if I baptized anybody. Oh, it's not important. I'll keep going on. And you get a sense that the scribe who was writing this down as Paul was moving back and forth was trying just to keep up. And you know, these letters, we have to rebuild the context that they were written in if we want to get to the root of what Paul is saying to the Corinthians, and therefore what Paul is saying to us. And today's passage does that. It's interesting because it gives us a glimpse at what is going on in Corinth. The Corinthian church was divided. And Paul knows this because Chloe's people had paid him a visit, told him all about what was going on. See, the situation in Corinth was that Paul was not the only apostle that they knew. He was their founder, but they had other apostles like Apollos and Cephas. And you may know Cephas is commonly known as Peter, one of the original disciples. People who have something to say. But this wasn't an uncommon practice, to have many different apostles. Itinerant preachers would come and go in a congregation. And they would be supported, they would be housed and fed by a wealthy member in the congregation who would become a patron to that apostle. And it's important for us to note that the conflict in Corinth isn't between Paul and Apollos or Cephas. The conflict has more to do with their followers. And so Paul quotes those different factions in Corinth, saying, some of you say, I belong to Paul. I belong to Apollos. I belong to Cephas. And there's even a group of spiritual elites who say, well, I belong to Christ. Well, Paul sees through their disguise, knowing that they're boasting. It's no different than any others in the congregation. Why are they boasting? What do they have to prove? Well, they thought they had something to prove. They wanted to prove that they were important. See, the city of Corinth had a culture of status seeking that the church was not immune to. And if you were a patron to an apostle, you had a kind of clout in that community, particularly if your apostle was popular, considered wise. Wisdom and power were hot commodities in the Corinthian context. And the more you had, the more honor, the more status and power you had. The Corinthians were jockeying for position in the church. And this is what was tearing the church apart. Now, divisions are one thing, but who are the real victims? We know that the church in Corinth wasn't just made up of these wealthy patrons. They had their whole households, including family, as well as slaves. And there was also a large number of what we would call the urban poor. And so the Corinthian church had a diverse social stratification. And evidence of this is given, Paul mentions a little later in the letter. Many of you weren't considered wise. Many of you weren't considered powerful. Many of you weren't of noble birth. Well, that means that, in fact, some of them were of noble birth, wise and powerful, but the majority were not. And it was those on the lowest rung of the social ladder that were suffering. They were suffering because of these social divisions. And so Paul gives them an example of this in his letter, in how they come together for the Lord's Supper. See, the Lord's Supper for them wasn't just that small piece of bread and that little cup of grape juice. It was a meal. A big celebration. And those wealthy people who were hosting those meals hosted them in the culture that was in Corinth. And so the best seats and the best food were saved for the most important people, the honored guests. And the meal would start when those important people showed up. Well, if you were a slave or someone who had to work long hours just to make ends meet, the meal would start well before you got there. And when you got there, they wouldn't save you a seat because you didn't have the social status needed. And often there'd be no food for you. And that meal wasn't just a ritual for you. It was a much-needed meal that week. And so Paul was scandalized by this news. The news that was brought to him, I said, by Chloe's people, who were members of that lower social class. The divisions in the Corinthian church were victimizing the poor, and they were crying out to Paul for him to do something. I think there are some connections we can make here with the Corinthian context. I wonder if Paul was writing to us today, would 1 Corinthians 13 sound a little like this? Each of you says, I belong to the Presbyterian Church. I belong to the Lutheran Church. I belong to the Catholic Church. Or, I belong to the non-denominational church. Has Christ been divided? Was John Calvin crucified for you? Was Martin Luther the name that you were baptized in? Are we a divided church? 2,000 years of church history says yes. From the schism between Eastern Orthodox and the Western Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, to the Reformation in the 16th century, splitting Protestants and Catholics, and to that continued animosity through history between those Protestant and Catholics, to the self-imposed and sometimes imposed racial divisions, to the ever-continuing liberal versus conservative theological debates. We as a church have not shown the kind of unity that Paul is advocating for. You know, at the same time, never before in history has the cry of the poor and marginalized been so loud and clear. Poverty-stricken countries like Haiti just struggling to make it through. War-torn countries like Afghanistan, oppressed people like those in Palestine. And right outside our very doors in downtown Kitchener, people suffer from homelessness, mental illness, abuse. All of these people like Chloe's people, are crying out for justice. Their suffering speaks against the church and its divisions, which prevent us from acting. Their cry should ring in our ears and wake us up to the reality around us, just as Paul's letter to the Corinthians was a wake-up call. So what did Paul prescribe for the Corinthians with their divisions? Does he assert his own authority by boasting himself? No. He writes, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to proclaim the gospel, and not with eloquent words of wisdom, so that the cross might not be emptied of its power. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved is the power of God." Foolishness is what he prescribes. The foolishness of the cross. And I believe this is something that by and large we don't get these days. Because today the cross as a symbol it's everywhere. It does not engender the kind of revulsion that it did for the people in Corinth. You know, to have your founder of your religion die on a cross was something you maybe wouldn't want to make known to the general public. Dying on a cross was humiliating. Dying on the cross meant you were a criminal. Dying on the cross meant you were cursed. Well, better not have any associations with someone like that if you're trying to climb the social ladder in Corinth. Let's keep that part of the story quiet. And instead, let's focus on wisdom. Eloquent wisdom. Yes, the cross was foolishness. But at the same time, it was the foundation of the Corinthians' faith. It was that common denominator and their source of unity. It was the place where they found salvation. And it was the one thing that Paul could appeal to, that all of them could say yes to. And not only was it their foundation of their faith, but Paul asked them to go deeper. Consider what it means for them. What does it mean that God should show his power and his wisdom through the weakness and foolishness of a cross? You know, if you want real wisdom, if you want real power, if you want to be honored, then you need to make yourself nothing. You need to humble yourself. You need to be weak and vulnerable. Paul says to them, if you want to boast, don't boast in Paul. Don't boast in Apollos. Don't boast in Cephas. And especially don't boast in your own spiritual elitism. Boast in God. One of my favorite scriptures is the one we read this morning. It's Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And after he finishes praying for his disciples, he prays for the ones who will come to believe because of their witness. I love it because it's Jesus' prayer for me. It's Jesus' prayer for us. It is Jesus' prayer for his church now and throughout all centuries. And what does he pray for? He prays only that we would be one. And not just one for unity's sake. No, one so that the world might know the love of God. That love that was shown to us in the foolishness of the cross. This morning, I pray that we could reclaim that understanding of the cross as foolishness. And that we would approach our brothers and sisters in Christ in a spirit of humility, in a spirit of weakness, and vulnerability, instead of arguing over doctrine or dogma, instead of boasting in our own accomplishments or our way of doing things. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that our differences don't matter. Our uniqueness as a denomination matters. You know, if denominations were all the same, I wouldn't be able to tell the joke, how many Presbyterians does it take to turn on a light bulb? Well, more than that, we as Presbyterians have something to add to the conversation of faith. Paul's not advocating for sameness. Diversity is good. It's division that is problematic. And you know, I may not agree with a Pentecostal or a Catholic point of view, but I am sure glad that they are around to contribute to that conversation of faith. But that conversation must happen openly and honestly, and above all, it must happen in the shadow of the cross, so that we might boast only in God. Now, it brings me great joy to be able to say that I think the church has come a long way in unity. On the local level, churches band together to run out of the cold programs, to share facilities and the cost of those facilities. Now, in Canada, the churches come together to advocate and petition the government on behalf of the marginalized. And churches partner and share resources to provide disaster relief. And internationally, the World Council of Churches seeks to find commonalities between us and seeks to build up the church around the world. And none of this could be done by any power of our own. Only by the foolishness of the cross could such unity be reached. Now, this morning, I'm going to up the ante, if I may. I've tried to make a case here for working together ecumenically. But I believe that just as the cross brings the church together, and just as Jesus prayed that we would be one, I think the church is called to partner with other faith traditions. Now, living faith, our statement of belief says that we approach other religions in humility, as one beggar telling another beggar where to find food. You know, interestingly and fittingly enough, that's a Buddhist proverb. And if amazing things can happen when the church works together, just think of what could happen if the Christian, the Muslim, the Jew, the Buddhist, the Hindu, and even the atheist could come together for the common good. I think the foolishness of the cross demands that we try, because the world is crying out in pain. The world is crying out for unity. The world is crying out that we might be one, so that the love of God might be shown